Hello and welcome to Chapter 2 of the Constitution and its Origins from the American Government, 3rd edition textbook from Open Stax. So we are going to talk about the Constitution, and of course here, written in 1787 and amended 27 times. The U.S. Constitution is a living document that basically is probably one of the world's greatest documents written to form a government. And it's been the basis of U.S. government for over 200 years, probably one of the longest serving pieces of documents that has controlled a government. So John Locke here was one of the most influential thinkers, and his writings were forming the basis for most of the modern political ideas that happened, of course, that helped base the U.S. Constitution. And before that, we'll talk about what was formed before the U.S. Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation, which is something that we'll talk about. So again, just a little introduction about this. The U.S. Constitution, created in September of 1787. Again, it is the oldest written constitution that still remains into effect of this day. And of course, but it wasn't something that was easily done. It wasn't done overnight. This wasn't let's have a meeting and let's get this done with in one night, or let's send it over emails, because of course emails didn't exist. It took a while, and before we had a U.S. Constitution, we had Articles of Confederation. So of course the framers, developed this over time, and of course it wasn't perfect. Even when the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, it wasn't perfect. And we still had to make changes even after that. And we'll see the changes that were made throughout the time period. Of course, it was significantly done to compromise. So there were things that were compromised to make the North and the South come together, because it wasn't easy. And remember, in those times, in the South, there was slavery. And that was the big elephant in the room. And how do you deal with Southern states who believed in slavery at that time, and how do you come together to form this Constitution? And of course, so we will talk about how that was done. So, of course, Locke and natural rights, the writings of John Locke, of course, the 17th century English political philosopher, had a great influence on this. Locke asserted that people possess natural rights, giving the right to life, liberty, and property. If you know, of course, we have that we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lo and behold, we changed property and put pursuit of happiness, because at those times, property, when the Constitution was instituted, and before that, property can only be in the hands of white men, and not women, and not people of color, and definitely so anybody with that, and not even slaves. So of course they had to change that. They didn't want people thinking, that you have your natural rights to have property. Locke's ideas of natural rights conflicted with the long-held belief in England, and of course in Western Europe. So we do have origins in English law from Locke. Ideas about life, liberty, and property can be traced back to the Magna Carta of 1215, way a long time ago. And of course, after King James II was deposed, the English Parliament passed English Bill of Rights in 1687. As you can see here, this was the Sons of Liberty, circulated. So this was in 1770. This was depicted this was when British soldiers attacked unarmed civilians in what was known as the Boston Massacre. And of course, it would be a famous portrayal, feature Crispus Attucks, an African American who was one of those first to die. And of course, 8 British soldiers were tried for the murder as a result of the confrontation. And I believe there is a movie actually about this, about the 8 soldiers that were tried for this. The American Revolution, right? One of the main reasons, of course, that the American Revolution happened was because people were tired of the taxation. Well, what happened, the reason why the King of England decided to tax the American colonies, because there was a war. And one of the things about Europe was it always was in war. So after the 7 Years' War, that happened between 1756 and 1763 between Britain and France. Britain gained ownership of all American land east of the Mississippi River, which of course the war is not cheap. Even in these days, war is very costly. It brought Britain to the brink of bankruptcy. So how do you get money from people? How do you raise money as a government, or as a monarchy or any form of government? How do you raise money? Well, you form taxes or you raise them, right? So the increased revenue, the British Parliament imposed new taxes, which of course the American colony, people living in the American colony, found that to be a very harsh measure, and they didn't like it because they had no say in those taxations. So of course we saw what was called the famous Tea Party, right? The movement of overthrowing tea for the displeasure of the British government. So of course now fast forward to 2010, they're forming a Tea Party because they believe that the government was being too intrusive. So the American Revolution, representation and protest. The American colonies were denied elected representation in Parliament. Remember, the American colonies were still under the leadership and control of King George. And so because of that, but the American colonies did not have any single type of elected official representing them in Parliament. Of course, because of this, when the taxations happened, they found that to be a violation of individual rights. And of course, there was a threat of the American colonies had a threat of boycott of British goods. So because of that, Britain sent additional troops to Boston. And that picture I showed you in a couple slides, where there was a ruckus going on, commotion, and these British soldiers opened fire, killing innocent civilians. And of course, that was the brink that really saw that there was immense tension between the colonists and Britain. So what we saw here was one of the first pursuits of government in the American colonies, right beyond, of course, the British Parliament or under British Parliament from British Parliament. Following further unrest in the colonies, of course, from the Tea Party, Parliament passed coercive acts, which essentially was they denied self-rule to Massachusetts, right? And of course, enraged colonists formed the first Continental Congress, which, again, I mentioned, it was the first sort of form of government to oppose the British rule, and this was kind of basically the steps taken towards being independent from the British government. So you can see here, so we'll get to this, of course, the presentation of the Declaration of Independence. Forming of it. So the Declaration of Independence happened on July 2nd of 1776. The Second Continental Congress declared independence from the British rule. And of course, the signing of the Declaration of Independence happened on July 4th, 1776. And of course, the Declaration of Independence reflected of Law King's view of life, liberty, and they, of course, remember I said the original part was life, liberty, and property, but of course, they changed that to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So, of course, Britain did not like this whole Declaration of Independence, and that was a signal to declare war. So Great Britain declared war on the rebellious Americans because they needed to be tamed and to make sure that they aligned with the British government or the British monarchy, and of course, with Great Britain. And of course, there was a military campaign, of course, to take down these what Britain saw as rebels. So, of course, you see here the Continental Army was formed, and of course, we know that it was headed by George Washington, and we won that war, of course. And of course, in November 1777, the Continental Congress approved the framework for a new government. So, once we defeated the British, the British, said, all right, here's, of course, they left, and of course, Now the United States was left to form its own government. And the first form of new government under being declared officially independent from Great Britain was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation required approval of all 13 colonies, of which you can tell was already a problem. Getting a full majority vote of all members is not easy. Of course, Maryland withheld its approval until March of 1781. After a series of defeats by the colonial army and its French ally, the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, of course, officially ending the American Revolution. With the ratification of the Articles of Confederation, it put an end to the American Revolution. So after being ratified, officially done, this created a new form of government. The Articles of Confederation provided for strong self-governing states and a weak central government. So essentially, the Articles of Confederation for the original 13 colonies, each colony, well, now called a state, self-governed itself. So imagine it's like 13 little countries under one roof. And of course, that was not going to be okay. And it had a weak central government. So the central government or the federal government was very weak. It really had no say in how the states had to function. So the states agreed to cooperate at the national level, but in limited areas such as defense. But how does the defense get money, right? If the self-governing states did not want to cooperate with that, it would be very difficult to raise an army, right? So a weak central government formed under the Articles of Confederation, and as I mentioned, lacked the power for taxation. And of course, in order for a government to work, you need some form of taxation. You need revenue to come in. And of course, the national government had to acquire funds from the states, which was, of course, taxation. States often fell behind on the obligation because really, who was going to tell them anything else, what to do? So, of course, there was problems with raising an army and navy. The national government was prohibited from raising a standing army or navy, and of course, that was really dangerous for a country not to have an established, standing, strong army and navy. And of course, and the government could not provide control to the western frontier. And of course, you had still some British forces stationed west of the Mississippi River, which, excuse me, technically, if the British government was strong enough, if the British army was strong enough, they could have attacked again, and who knows what could have happened. And of course, and what was going on too at this time was American ships were being attacked by piracy. So there were pirates out there, kind of the Captain Jack Sparrow, Pirates of the Caribbean style pirates. Those existed, and of course, a lot of ships, the American ships, would be attacked, and of course, because there was a lack of navy. So I want you to now have a review and think about this. What core values led to the American Revolution and the writings of the Articles of Confederation? How do these values and beliefs affect American politics today? So current tariffs, currency, tariffs, and trade problems, right? The national currency during those times, the Articles of Confederation was pretty worthless and rarely used because most citizens preferred using the currency of the state bank that they were under. So again, and of course, which was permitted under the Articles of Confederation. So as I mentioned, each state basically function like its own like its own country, and that was the problem. So imagine living in those times in the 13 colonies. Let's say, for example, you lived in Virginia and you wanted to go to Maryland. It would be like going to a whole different country. You had to use currency of that state, and just a whole different things that work there. Now, of course, in today's age in the United States, right, you can go to Florida, if you're from Illinois or Oklahoma, and then you go to Florida or New York, right? We all use the same currency. That wasn't the case back in the days of the Articles of Confederation, right? Citizens of other states, however, were reluctant to accept currency produced by a different bank, which crippled the interstate commerce. And of course, the national government lacked the power to impose tariffs. Again, just no sense of power from the central government. Of course, in 1786, a convention called the call to revise the Articles of Confederation failed with only 5 states sent delegates. And of course, in order to do anything to convene everybody, the Articles of Confederation required the consent of all 13 states for revisions, which of course was not easy to do. So a second convention was called to meet in Philadelphia in 1787. Only 12 states sent delegates to the convention. Revisions remained impossible. The delegates to the Federal Convention decided to scrap the whole thing and form a brand new government. They realized these Articles of Confederation were not going to work, so let's form a new government. So, points of contention. The delegates to the Federal Convention faced numerous things, right? Among the states, right? The strengthening the national government however, they want a high level of state power. What the delegates didn't want was another powerful king. That's what they feared the most. Again, and that was the scare. They were scared, or they were afraid that the national government was going to get too powerful under one individual. They wanted to protect the small states from the national government, or from, of course, more bigger states that had more populace. So they didn't want like Delaware didn't want a state like New York, which of course Delaware is pretty small compared to New York. They didn't want it to overpower it with having more to say. And of course, a state like Delaware didn't want the national government overtaking it. And of course, the southern states wanted a continuation to permit states to allow slavery. And that was a point of contentions in that time period, right? And again, as I mentioned earlier, that was the big elephant in the room, was slavery. Yes, we had about the national power and about protecting small states, but the big elephant in the room at that time was slavery. So how do the delegates form a government, a much more powerful government, that you, of course, had to take into consideration slavery? So, of course, representation, small versus large states. There were two competing plans for state representation. You had the Virginia plan and you had the New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan provided representation in a bicameral national legislature, where the number of representatives from each state. So, of course, the representatives were based on the population of each state. The New Jersey plan provided a unicameral national legislature with equal representatives for each state. And the slavery was another one. After the American Revolution, the legislators in some states required the immediate abolition of slavery. But southern states, however, retained slavery to support its agricultural economy. And of course, they wanted to include representation. They wanted the slaves to include as part of their representation. And of course, you had federal supremacy versus state sovereignty, right? Delegates from states favored a strong national government with the power to tax and raise, of course, in order to raise a standing army and navy and regulate interstate commerce. Delegates from other states feared that a strong national government, of course, would deprive its citizens of liberties. And of course, they feared the experience that they had under the British Parliament. So they had to be careful with that. And of course, individually versus social stability. There were some delegates that a strong national government would deprive citizens of its individual rights. So there had to be a compromise. So you had to take into consideration the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, right? So there were numerous disagreements, and of course, the Virginia plan here called for a two-house legislature. Both houses would be based on population. The states represented in one house would be elected by the state's voters. The New Jersey plan favored maintaining a one-house Congress with each state being equally represented. So there had to be a great compromise. And so what happened was there was the great compromise called the bicameral legislature, right? So what we have today, we have a representation in the House of Representatives based on each state's population, right, which was under the Virginia plan. And of course, you have another representation of the Senate, which is consistent of equal number of representatives for each state, which was part of the New Jersey plan. So, of course, today you have a bicameral legislature. So the House of Representatives It is based on each state's population, and of course, each state is given a number of representatives based on its population. And of course, the Senate, no matter the size, is given 2 senators. So, of course, that was then, of course, regarding election of legislators, members of the House would be elected by 2-year terms by popular vote of eligible voters in the state, and the state legislators would elect members of the Senate for 6-year terms. And of course, that we changed that with an amendment. So back in the day, at the beginning, the Senate was elected by state legislators for a 6-year term. And what do we do about slavery? So, in order to deal with the issue of slavery, there was a 3/5 compromise. And of course, the delegates debated whether enslaved people should count towards the population, because that would also, because if that was so, then it would have each state, the states would have congressional apportionment in the House of Representatives, meaning, so southern states would probably have more representatives if they counted slaves as the population. Southern states had a higher population of enslaved people, and they argued that enslaved people should be counted towards each state's population. But here's the other side, right? Of course, they didn't have rights, but they wanted to include them as a population because they wanted the power. So under the terms of the Great Compromise, the number of members of the House of Representatives increase the number of members of the House of Representatives allowed to some slave states. So the northern states opposed including enslaved people for the sole purpose of congressional apportionment. They didn't favor the idea. The northern states like New York and Delaware and New Jersey, for example, Pennsylvania, they didn't like the idea that southern states like South Carolina and such would be able to obtain use slaves as a population, but only for that sole purpose. It's like, no. So we had the 3/5 compromise. Basically, one slave counted as 3/5 of a person. So yes, that was the thing. So the 3/5 compromise resolved the dispute about inclusion of slaves in each state's population for the purpose of a congressional apportionment. Under this agreement, each state's population for the purpose of congressional apportionment and direct taxation would consider the total number of each state's free citizens plus 3/5 of the total number of each state's slaves. Other slavery issues, of course, address the issues regarding the issue of slavery, the prohibition of the abolition of the foreign slave trade until 1808, permitting domestic slave trade, and requiring states that didn't have a permanent slavery to return free seekers who came there for refuge, right? Separation of powers and checks and balances. Of course, there was a system of checks and balances between federal and state, right? They didn't want the federal government to become too powerful, so we had, of course, implement separation of powers and a system of checks and balances. So the separation of powers first, there was 3 branches of government. So 3 branches of government you can see as kind of like 3 different departments. You have the legislative branch, which was under Article 1, had a bicameral legislator. So you have the U.S. Congress and, of course, the U.S. Congress consisted of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. The executive branch under Article 2, of course, for the U.S. President to serve as the head of state, head of government, and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And the judicial branch, which the establishment of the Supreme Court allows for the creation of lower federal courts through congressional action. So you see here the three separate branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. And you can see here, and of course, no branch, the separation of powers allowed for no branch to get more powerful than the other. So there is always a system of checks and balances. So the executive would make sure that the judicial doesn't get out of hand and gain too much power. The legislature would make sure it doesn't get out of hand with power. So legislature creates the laws, the executive enforces the laws, and of course the judicial interprets the laws that were established. So the Constitution defines separation of powers. So again, legislative branch makes the powers, executive enforces the powers, and the judicial branch tries any cases under the federal laws and instances defined in Article 3. Of course, the Constitution provides a system of checks and balances, again, not to exceed a power over the other. And so here's an example. While Congress has the power to pass legislation to become law, the president is authorized to veto or reject the legislation and prevent it from becoming law. The Constitution, however, grants Congress the power to override presidential veto by 2/3 votes in the House and Senate. So that is a classic form of checks and balances. Also, Congress may also check the president's authority as commander-in-chief, and Congress may limit the president's otherwise expansion powers over foreign policy. So, just a little review question to answer yourself. What is the Bill of Rights? So answer that. Take a second or a while to answer that. What is the Bill of Rights? Impeachment and removal. The legislative branch's most powerful tool to restrict the power of the executive branch is, of course, in regards to anytime they feel that someone is getting out of hand, is, of course, the congressional power to impeach and remove the president and or other officers of the executive branch. So the Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution states that Congress can impeach or remove a president, a vice president, federal judge, or other executive officers if they've done any treason, bribery, other higher crimes and misdemeanors. A little side note, there has been impeachment of the president, but no president has ever been removed from office through the impeachment process. There has been, most recently, President Trump was impeached twice by Congress, but never fully thrown out of the presidency from after he was not tried by the Senate. So, of course, you can see here that the House drafts articles of impeachment, which must be approved by simple majority. And, of course, the Senate may convict and remove the impeached official by 2/3 majority. So, for example, when it came to former President Trump, he was impeached twice by the House, but he was never convicted by the Senate. President Clinton was impeached as well, but he was never convicted by the Senate. There has yet to be a U.S. president who has yet to be removed after being impeached. President Nixon resigned from office because he would have certainly been impeached and removed from office by the Senate. Judicial review. Judicial review is part of the federal judiciary, serves as the checks on actions both by legislative and executive, called judicial review. Although the Constitution did not specifically state judicial review, it has become an ever power naturally under of course, the third branch, of course, the courts, under federal law, serves as the supreme law of the nation. And of course, this was the major case of Marbury versus Madison, which allowed for judicial review, basically giving the federal court, the Supreme Court, the final authority and say. So, federal versus state power. The Constitution established a federal system in which power is divided between national and, of course, state. And, of course, national or federal government only act within specific areas of the Constitution, specifically given by the national government power stated in the Constitution, which is also known as enumerated powers. All powers not specifically given to the federal government are known as reserved powers, and, of course, those are reserved for the states. So that, of course, becomes a lot of debate, and we're seeing that in certain issues that has come up. If it's not within the federal government's rules given, or whether or not the federal not given the Constitution, then the states have every right to grant such powers to themselves to enforce. So reserve powers allow the states to pass intrastate legislation, such as laws on commerce, drug use, and marriage. So intrastate means within the state. So, of course, sometimes judicial rulings at the federal level may supersede such legislation. So, whenever a state does any such laws, the federal government may step in and determine those types of legislations illegal. The Supremacy Clause, that is areas in which both the federal and state governments must have the power to act. And of course, the U.S. Constitution, federal laws, and treaties made by the United States is the supreme law of the land. So the federal law, therefore, supersedes any state law or action that conflicts with the U.S. Constitution, federal law, or U.S. treaty. For example, if the government, the state government of Oklahoma, or the governor of Oklahoma, wanted to enact its own state law, or form its own treaty with another country, foreign country, that would be in direct violation of a current U.S. treaty. The federal government has every right to step in and null that and say no, you can't. Oklahoma government cannot do that, or any other state government. So state government cannot supersede any federal law or any U.S. treaty. The ratification process. Although delegates to the Constitution approved the final draft in 1787, the terms of the U.S. Constitution itself prevented it from entering into force until 9 of the 13 states had ratified it. States convened ratification conventions to debate the merits. Delegates to state ratification conventions debated the issues, the power of the federal government, and whether the Constitution went too far. And of course, you had what I would say is, or some other individuals would say, is kind of the formation of the two-party system began with the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. The Federalists are those who favor the ratification, meaning the U.S. Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists were opposed to such thing. And of course, so that's what we had a debate about, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, right? So Federalists favored what was going on in regards to the U.S. Constitution, the ratification of it. Anti-Federalists were against it. So you can see here a little cartoon from back in the day. Ratification. In June of 1788, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, thereby reaching the requisite number of states to enter of the document to enter force. Political reality, however, required that the populous and powerful states of Virginia and New York ratify the Constitution in order for its new form of government to work effectively. Virginia ratified the Constitution of June of 1788. So the Constitution came into effect on March 4th, 1789. So you can see here a timeline of which each state ratified the new Constitution. The amendment process. So a major flaw of the Articles of Confederation, remember that, was its requirement that amendments of the Articles be approved by unanimous consent of the states. So imagine getting all 13 original states to agree, right? It was almost nearly impossible to get a unanimous consent. So despite the ineffectiveness of the national government under the Articles of Confederation and the resulting economic problems, the document was never amended. And so we learned, the delegates learned that, you have to allow for the Constitution to be amended. Recognize that was a problem. So, of course, the Constitution now has 27 amendments, right? So if we want to add an amendment to the Constitution, there is a process. So proposing amendments, so there is a process for proposal of amendments. Congress may impose an amendment which must pass with 2/3 approval in both the House and the Senate. And the states may call for a national convention, which will be held after approval by 2/3 of state legislators. So ratifying amendments. After an amendment to the Constitution has been proposed by either Congress or National Convention, the proposal may then be ratified by 3/4 approval of either the state legislators or state ratifying conventions. After an amendment is proposed by either Congress or the National Convention, Congress chooses whether it must be ratified by the state legislature or state ratifying conventions. The 21st Amendment, which repealed provision under the 18th Amendment, is the only amendment ever approved by state ratifying conventions. Key constitutional changes. In September 1789, Congress approved 12 amendments to the Constitution, primarily to address concerns of Anti-Federalists. So state legislators ratified 10 of the 12 proposed amendments, the first of the 10. In the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, the Congress proposed amendments to abolish slavery and address the rights of freed slaves. Of course, that includes the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which provide the protection of civil liberties and civil rights. So an individual, perhaps very well known during the Civil War, I'm sorry, a very famous individual, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, if I said that correctly, was a very famous individual. She taught secondary school, wrote poetry, and participated in social movements related to race and gender. And she helped establish the National Association of Colored Women and fighting for a woman's right to vote. And so you can see her on the left-hand side, an undated photo of herself, taken this, of course. We see here a very famous Amanda Gorman, who prepares to recite her inaugural poem. So we move on after, of course, the Constitution itself was not always perfect, and one of the things it missed is the women for the right to vote. And of course, women weren't given the right to vote automatically. So there was a suffrage movement for the right of women to vote. And of course, before the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1920, only a few Western states, such as Wyoming, gave women the right to vote. Other notable amendments, the 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of U.S. senators by voters. So if you remember, when the Constitution was first formed, the state legislators of the state would elect or select the two U.S. Senate members. Of course, the 17th Amendment changed all that, having the direct election of U.S. senators by voters. The 19th Amendment provides women the right to vote. 24th, abolish poll taxes, which would disenfranchise African American voters. And the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18 years of age.